So we're here at Cloud Foundry Summit, and I just want to take a little bit of a pause from the technology just to talk about some of the human factors that go along with this. With the digital transformation that we're seeing and the move to faster cycles and cloud native and DevOps, and really all of the buzzwords that you can come up with, there is a huge amount of cultural issues that we see coming on. And so I just want to take a moment and kind of get some perspective on that. So I just want to open it up and maybe ask for a couple stories of potential clients that you might have had that were either very successful or potentially not. Redact names as needed. And also maybe some best practices, and for anybody who's listening, any kind of things to watch out for when they're making this type of transformation. So, Lucas, you're the farthest away, so.
Well, I guess I'll just start with something to look out, and that is absolutely not to steamroll your developers. Okay. I've seen different perspectives, like especially here, coming from the Cloud Foundry perspective, I've seen lots of teams that had really early container adoption using Docker, maybe even Docker Swarm, and waltzing in, telling them, you don't get to use that anymore, you need to use Cloud Foundry now. That's something that's really hard to get those developers to come on board, which is where the whole Adfinis stuff comes in very nicely, because it enables them to still use their Docker know-how for the time being, maybe switch it up to being full Kubernetes native, and then from that progressing towards using build packs, and in the end being already ready for Cloud Foundry before they even realize that they're now using Cloud Foundry. Especially in the enterprise sector, where lots of people that used to use Cloud Foundry, like say 6 or 7 years ago, are still very afraid of it being like this monolithic deployment tooling that had a large ops team that wouldn't talk to them and didn't really help.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, keeping developers happy is pretty important. One of the things that we've been talking to some customers recently about is measuring lead time to production, and being able to get changes quickly into production is not only good for your business, it's good for your developers. It will keep them motivated as well. And kind of to your point about not clobbering the developers, the technology has to be subservient to the human factors, to the developers that want to keep working for your business, and also to the goal of being able to get business value into production quickly. Like, if you are using some other technologies and it works well for you, great. Make sure you're measuring the lead time to production. Try doing experiments. If it gets shorter, great. It doesn't have to be one particular technical solution or another.
Nice.
Pretty much taking off where Lucas ended, or taking one word of what he said, it was like being afraid, fear. The problem quite often with that kind of new technologies being established is that it's basically thrown at the people. It's quite often like, somebody's getting up, sitting on a breakfast table and deciding now, we go into a cloud environment and we choose Cloud Foundry or whatever, for the sake of choosing something and for pretty much having a check mark there. So that is one of the biggest concerns, the biggest failures there that we quite often see, and it is basically ultimately bringing in a lot of negative disruption into such a process. So what we basically always try to embrace is understanding cloud pretty much from end to end as a strategy. So onboarding the people properly, ensuring they understand the principles, but not only the technical stuff, but also the line of business and the C-level. So it's pretty much to be understood as a strategy, and having that in mind and executing that can help making a successful transformation into a cloud environment. So and not doing that is pretty much a blueprint for a failure.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned not enforcing changes on people, and it's very important to make sure that if you're going to try getting folks to do things a new way, they have to feel comfortable and able to do it the new way before you tell them that's going to be the future. So often, using little either Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of pair programming with our customers so that we're showing engineers how to do something, and then when we've gone, they've actually done it. It's not just like instructor-led training has its place, but if you just tell people a load of information about a thing, like, we're going to do it this way, here's a training course, here's some PowerPoint slides, and the next week you've got to change everything about the way that you work. People are going to be fearful, they're not going to have very great confidence, they're not going to feel in control of their own working lives. If you can sit down with someone and show them how to do it, make sure that they're doing it, and then at the end of the day, it's like, you do realise you just pushed an app to Cloud Foundry and it happened in minutes, and you can do that, then people are much more warm and receptive to the idea.
Great. Hey, the joys of doing a video at a conference.
So pretty important, pretty important in that regard is actually not throwing or not jumping on that technology buzzword bingo kind of train. Containers here, I don't know, Cloud Foundry there, everything as a service over there, it does not make sense at all.
But maybe focusing on the value.
Yeah, exactly. And basically allowing the people to make their own experiences and ultimately adopting it their own way.
Right.
That is quite important.
Nice.
Yeah, I think especially getting the buy-in from the developers pretty early is important. There's nothing worse than just telling your people, hey, we decided for you. Maybe you have decided, but you can kind of
do that
ask
once.
the developers, what are your ideas? In the end, you will decide as management, but if the developers got asked early in the onboarding process, they won't feel like steamroll, because they will feel like they had some say in the platform. Maybe even someone raises an issue that's important.
It almost feels like the sales cycle isn't over when the sale is finalized. There is still a sales cycle going on internally to get through the actual usage.
I would even broaden that because it's not only the developers. It's also, then again, line of business. You said business value that needs to be transformed into something useful. It's also the C-level. So when you just decide for them, you ultimately end up having some sort of opposition there. You create an internal resistance. So the important thing is to communicate, to have a plan, to ultimately onboard people, allowing them to make their own experiences, to change the process if necessary, bring in governance, and ensure that pretty much nobody is left behind. And that is actually then the art of doing that kind of transformation, completely regardless of the technology. If you have good technology in place, that is pretty much to some extent a servant that is basically just pushing the things forward in a gentle way. So you open opportunities instead of just forcing things to happen, and that is very, very important in that regard.
Yeah, touching on your point about the value chain, it's really important about the management. It's really important to cover the whole value chain,
exactly,
from really management down to the end users, even in some cases.
Yeah. And basically, perhaps even the first step is to bring in management, C-level, line of business, because that kind of transformation is basically a revolution that is done from top to bottom, and not the other way around. It's of course a technical thing, but ultimately it's like 30% technology and 70% processes, approaches, mindset, and basically sitting on the same table and working with each other. And speaking of examples, we were involved in a project where basically the upper management understood it is some sort of a revolution from the top, but they did, besides that, everything wrong. They just said, do it that way. Everything else is completely wrong in regard to an approach. And that ultimately ended up basically paralyzing that kind of enterprise for a while. So that is also what is to be understood upfront. You cannot do that without taking and involving the people and making sure they basically comply with your ideas.
There's organizational change is going to be fundamentally limited unless management are willing to change as well, and the management playbook. I mean, I think we've spoken before about the iron triangle of people come to management and managing software development as if it's manufacturing on a physical production line, and they're trying to produce a million identical widgets with as few variations and errors as possible. And that's not really what software development is. We are being asked to do new things every day. And the traditional management playbook is like, if I'm going to do a thing, I want to know what exactly am I going to get, when is it going to be done by, and how much is it going to cost? Now, those are reasonable questions to ask if you're building a nuclear power plant. Right. I should imagine. I mean, I've never built one, but if I was going to ask someone to build me a nuclear power plant, I want answers to those questions. But all the time that management are asking those questions, they're going to drive the same behaviours that there always have been. Instead, you need to ask folks to start looking at things more about opportunity. So instead of what exactly are you going to build for me, it's how is the world going to change? What's the metric? What's the thing that we're going to observe being different after we've released this product, this project, whatever it is? Instead of how much is it going to cost, how much opportunity is there? How much money am I going to make when this thing is done? How much money am I not making for every week that it isn't done by? Right. And that brings us to, instead of when is it going to be done, how urgent is it? Right. Leaders use, the simplest tool for expressing urgency is deadline. How do I make sure that my project's the most important thing? I pick the deadline soonest to today. And that's not really, it's too blunt. If we can quantify projects by, we're going to lose $100,000 every week that this isn't done, then that's something meaningful. We compare and contrast and work out how to prioritize things that way. And so having leaders on board with that, you're going to have to do things differently as well. Right. That's when you get really effective cultural transformation happening. And you can change things lower down in the dev process to a certain extent, but the impact of that is going to be limited because ultimately leaders are the ones driving the behavior of the organization.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the leaders on the mid-tier are just as important. If you have like a whole team of app managers that are used to having 3 releases per year, well, it's going to be them that need to change more of their processes than the developers, because good developers, and I hope you hired good developers, they've been doing test-driven development not since now, but since like 5 years at least. I mean, extreme programming, where this whole thing started, is from the 90s after all.
Touching on those points, one of the biggest challenges is actually bringing in some sort of an agile mindset. I know it is a huge buzzword, but it is the truth. Not having an agile mindset in place is basically having that kind of leadership that is defined by having 3 iterations a year, and then not planting that idea of agile iteration, of short terms in which you iterate, is something, if you don't have it, it's a huge problem. It ends up then having agile being understood as something like, I tell you now what I expected to have yesterday. So and we've seen that in projects happening. The problems is quite often not with the developers. They should be at least aware of something like test-driven development, extreme programming, something like that. And each organization needs to find its own, kind of flavor for that. But the point is, if the rest of the organization is not adjusted to that kind of agile idea, to that kind of iterational approach, it's basically like always jumping against some sort of a glass roof all the time. So you basically hurt yourself, and then nobody is going to execute properly. And then it's again throwing technology at problems instead of solving those problems.
Right, and it's a whole lot harder to have the agile mindset than say, like, check the agile tick box. You can have we're Scrum and we have a Scrum Master because,
we've got a certified Scrum Master, therefore and we are now agile.
And we've set up an agile ITIL process. Welcome to basically the hell. Right. But ultimately, establishing that is very important, and also establishing that kind of error mentality. It is perfectly okay to make failures, to do something wrong. If you iterate in a pretty short cycle, you can basically understand what went wrong, you can learn from that, and you can adjust to that. Getting rid of that kind of waterfall model that is pretty much present everywhere is very important in that regard. So again, technology, processes, approaches, mindsets, it all belongs together. And one without the other is just some sort of a buzzword bingo then once again.
Absolutely, and it's not even really that specific to IT. I mean, lots of
Absolutely.
these things we've been doing, they come from this lean way of thinking, and they go way back to like Toyota style management with just-in-time production, which we've been using those tools, and those tools
For
are
30,
great,
40
but
years
it
now,
isn't IT specific.
minimum.
So even other companies should be able to understand that, especially in non-IT companies, the management should be able to have some grasp about
These are not
why
new
we're doing
ideas.
stuff like this.
Exactly.
I do wonder if there's an education problem in that. So we were working with a customer. We kind of delivered our final findings a couple of weeks ago, and they had problems that if you read the Toyota production system or read about Kanban would have been so obvious. They had huge amounts of invisible inventory piling up in the form of pull requests. They had 90 open pull requests on this repo, and it wasn't going through CI quickly enough. And they thought they had a CI problem, but it was much more of a process problem. And so you could talk to the development folks about lean and doing things just in time and pull-based workflows, and that would have been fine, but their projects were being driven by commercial folks and marketing folks and sales people that had signed contracts. And I do wonder whether there's something missing in, because a lot of the deadlines and the work that we're being asked to do in development functions is being driven by those folks. Like, does the Toyota production system, do Lean, do Kanban get taught for the people that go and do business studies degrees? That, like, why do marketing seem to have such a problem with just in time?
Right.
Why don't we book the marketing and like work out where we're going to sell it after it's built? Let's build the thing. And then once we're sure it works, then we can do all the advertising for it.
Right. And there's the fundamental equation of like the amount of work in progress reduces your throughput.
Yeah,
right.
Oh, absolutely.
So you have constraints right there.
They had really terrible flow efficiency,
Yeah.
but everyone was busy, but nothing was coming out of the development department. I think it's interesting on that kind of marketing note to look at video games and things like Fortnite and Sea of Thieves and these games as a service, where actually it's becoming much more. Instead, in the past, video games marketing was planned a year or two in advance. Right, you're going to be the Christmas release for next year.
Right.
Whereas now, marketing is happening at the time of release of a feature, instead of there being a long hype build up because it's been planned in advance. It's like, let's build the features, let's work out what's going to go into this release. Now we can do the marketing and and surprise people with it rather than kind of do these things in advance.
But the problem is that hurts. So if you want to go that route, you need to basically educate everybody being involved there. You need to basically change their mindsets. And quite often the problem with management or with line of business or with marketing, whatever, is ultimately they want to have the fast time to market. They want to have the good kind of quality. They want everything, but they do not want to change anything. So the idea and what we usually transfer as message is it needs to hurt. You need to change. Changing yourself is a very complicated process. You need to get rid of your habits. You need to gain a clear picture of yourself. And you need to basically understand what you need to change on yourself, on your organization, in your department. And that is something which is quite often understood as they need to change.
Right.
Instead of I have to change, instead of I have to become a leader in that regard and not a follower. So everybody else needs to change. I'm not.
Right.
Basically, that's then again the blueprint for failure.
Right.
And that is not covered by some sort of a failure culture.
Right.
Definitely not.
Yeah, I think about people wanting to be specialists. It's something else that I've seen a lot recently, just by coincidence more than anything else, of some developers only wanting to do one thing and one thing only. And I was in that position myself. I mean, going back a good few years, I wanted to be a Java developer. I only wanted to write Java. If I spent any time learning anything else, like if I put in a bit of, I don't know, Python in this ear, and a little bit of Java would fall out of that ear. And that's how I thought about the world. And I was obviously completely wrong. And so I was resistant to learning different things because I thought it was a waste of time.
We always did it that way. It's one expression of that kind of mentality. I learned Java. It's perfect. It can solve any kind of problem. Yeah.
And that kind of desire for specialism and to be an expert in one area, I think leads to people becoming too comfortable and becoming too ingrained in their habits, and therefore it's harder then to pick up new and different things. And I don't know quite how we, at a fundamental level, change the industry so that people don't want to be. I mean, it's kind of happening anyway. There's a certain amount of prestige in being a polyglot developer, and if in the workplace we can celebrate the people that can do multiple things, we can incentivize the people that learn multiple languages, then maybe that will help shift things. But I think there's a kind of correlation there between people that want to be specialists and then at a very physical, biological level, the habits are more deeply ingrained. The more that you use certain neurons, the more insulated they get with myelin,
exactly.
and so the more efficient they become. So when you're asking someone to do something different, you're asking them to use more calories. Like your brain now has to work harder because you're doing something different. And I figure that the more that you've done only one thing your entire life, the harder that's going to be to break. And when you get into the habit of doing something different every day, it's all right, I'm going to be doing some Python today, then you kind of get used to it.
Yeah, I guess not only for developers but also for platform builders, this shift has been happening. A couple of years ago, you had Linux, you had it on your bare metal, you were able to know what each file does on this box. Nowadays you have like Kubernetes with some Cloud Foundry on top. It's not possible anymore to be like that specialist that can cover everything. So it's much more natural to actually reach out to others and to discuss stuff, because it's pretty much clear that we don't have the capacity anymore to know everything about a platform.
But ultimately, you still need to have that kind of culture that embraces getting out of your comfort zone. Because that's one of the major problems there, that kind of comfort zone. I'm the expert for that specific kind of Linux dialect. I'm the expert for whatever, WebSphere application server. And everything else is just crap bullshit, and it's not going to work. Sorry for the words. But the point is, changing that kind of mentality, and then again, forcing people out of their comfort zone without losing them is again one of the challenges we have, because they quite often get into some sort of an inner immigration then. They pretend to be on board, but they are actually not. They are pretty much signing off to some extent.
I think there's an interesting point about comfort zones that I used to teach a traditional form of jiu-jitsu, a Japanese martial art, and comparing kind of traditional Japanese martial arts with combat sports and things like MMA, when you're coaching someone in a sporting format, you often grow their comfort zone from the inside out. They're in their comfort zone, and then you give them encouragement and you give them challenges which they can overcome, so their comfort zone gets bigger and bigger. Whereas with traditional martial arts, I think there's more of a culture of dragging people outside their comfort zone, and it's sink or swim. And I wonder how much we do in our organisations to kind of allow people to do that, but in a safe way. So you'd think about a traditional enterprise and like, what do you do about? We get asked this in interviews when we're hiring people. Like, so what do you do about training? So, well, you'd be learning things every day, all the time, constantly. Yeah. Like, we don't have a training budget in particular. If you want to go on a course, let us know. But compared to a traditional organisation, it's like, well, I get to go on one course a year. That's probably not going to be able to keep up with the rate of change.
Keep learning every day, every time.
So maybe to redirect a little bit, for like the CIO or somebody in a little bit more upper level who is probably used to really well knowing the technology that's in their stack, and at this point it's moving so fast that you can't even keep up with what the market's doing, much less what the piece of the market that you're using is doing. Is there any tips and tricks there that maybe can help a CIO kind of overcome that fear of falling behind, but also maybe the fear of not knowing exactly what's going on?
I think the outcomes have got to be key. The guiding lights of things like your lead time to production, your flow efficiency, and then second to that, your resource utilization. How much value are you getting out of your development department? Because then everything else doesn't matter. As long as those things are all trending in the right direction, like maybe you've never heard of Kubernetes, and you've got a load of engineers telling you need to get moved from Heroku to Kubernetes. It's like, I don't know what that is. That makes me uneasy. We'll try it out. Oh, lead time is increasing. This probably isn't a good idea. Those fundamentals should give you an insight as to whether you're doing things in the right direction.
Yeah, it's also about being ready to fail early and to do course corrections if you fail. You can try something, but if just because everyone's telling you to do Kubernetes, you don't need to.
I would agree with both of the statements, and I would like to add basically, don't think of the technology. You've hired experts, so do it as Steve Jobs did. He's unfortunately dead. He basically tried to have people around him being better than him, being more skilled than him, and just giving them guidelines. So measuring what they are doing, ensuring that whatever they do is able to run on your platform, and whatever they do is has its boundaries and is basically abstracted from everything else in a sense it makes sense from an architectural perspective. So that's all that matters. So if you have like 10 technologies in your stack, good. If you have like 100, even better, or even worse if it's not going to work out. Measure it, and then you can basically and ultimately understand if it's going into the right direction or not. That kind of, I tell you what kind of technology is to be used, exactly that framework and exactly that version, with exactly that kind of database, is that kind of I control everything thinking, which basically ensures that you are not able to keep up with the technology and with the market. So you have hired experts, foster that kind of mindset, and ensure they feel comfortable in that regard, trying out new technologies and understanding how they work, so they can basically ensure they do the right decision there. So that is the idea there. So get rid of some control, not on an overall scale, but do not do micromanagement then again. Right. So let them decide, they are the experts.
Yeah, and those are maybe the code experts, but you also need to consider like people from the governance side of things, maybe risk management or stuff that will actually help you not only measure if your metrics are being more successful, but will also maybe see something that a dev just doesn't see, like with risk management.
Don't forget about security. So basically then we are again in processes, bringing in that kind of, I do not want to say that word, but bringing in that kind of DevOps mentality, Sec DevOps, DevSecOps, DevOps,
whatever the word
whatever.
is now.
End-to-end collaboration.
Yes.
Complete ownership of the problem.
So bring in the experts, and it's not only developers, it's not only guys that operate stuff, it's pretty much everybody being involved there. Bring them to the table and make them talk to each other. That's very important.
There's a movement called Working Out Loud, which I went to a digital transformation conference, which was of great interest to me, I thought. And it was basically about enterprise social networks. And so digital transformation means so many different things to different people. But one of the things I found really interesting about that was this Working Out Loud movement was about letting other people know what you're working on, sharing it with them, showing them the results whilst it's work in progress. And for an engineer, I was like, is this news to anyone?
Right.
Like, we have a stand up and you see my code in the Git repo. But of course, if you're writing reports, or maybe if you're in the security department or some governance or compliance or something else, your manager comes in, asks you to do a thing, you beaver away on it for 2 weeks, and then you produce a final report that's had all the mistakes taken out of it because you've gone over it 15 times. It goes to your manager, no one ever sees it, and then you get your next thing to do. So I guess for a lot of people, that working in the open is actually new. It's probably quite scary. And so, you were talking about collaboration and getting people involved. The more people that lead by example by working in the open and showing people their work as it's still going on whilst it's not perfect, will demonstrate a little bit of vulnerability and let those folks know that it's okay to do so. And slowly, like the kind of tangled mess of knots eases up. Once everyone relaxes and realizes, okay, I can be honest and clear with these people.
Right, and having that security in your workplace, that you can give that, and know that the feedback's going to be critique as opposed to criticism.
Yeah, the psychological safety of doing that.
It's a matter of confidence, ultimately.
You
need to be confident that whatever you do is working out to some extent. You are not criticized for a mistake, for a failure. You're only criticized if you do not communicate properly, if you do not involve other stakeholders properly. That is then again a huge kind of cultural shift that needs to happen, because it's then not again limited to just the engineer or just the, I don't know, security specialist. That actually needs to happen then again on pretty much every level of an organization, because if you don't do that, there is that kind of separation between things then once again, and things are not visible and understood properly within an organization. And then again, we are talking about cultural change for something which is, generally more understood as a technology thing, and changing that kind of perspective towards making it a cultural thing. Is so important, because then again, if you don't do that, I mean, every one of us can basically, I don't know, bring in like 10 examples within a minute. What went wrong within project, but it quite often boils down to that kind of mentality overall.
I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a CTO, and he's just taken on a new role. And he asked us to come in and look at some of the problems they had, but his main thrust was he had some issues with Kubernetes and expensive contractors who have taken months to not deliver anything. That was definitely a concern. But his main thrust was, in a year's time, I want to have this culture. I want technology to be the heart of everything we do. I want the technologists to be the superstars. This is what I want to do, because I know that if I get that bit right, we will have awesome technical solutions. He wasn't so worried about, we've got to use this technology and that technology, and driving down the budget or anything like that. It's got to have great culture, got to attract the best people, and then the rest will sort itself out. And that was really encouraging to hear.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts? Or?
Well, I'll just start and say, I think for cultural change, it's really important to think about all of this, to think about the whole value chain, and to get ahead of the ship, so you can actually steer it now, so you get in the direction you want to be.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I've said for a few times now, measure the lead time to production and work out. As a leader in technology, your job is to make a machine that makes business solutions. Your job is not to make business solutions. You're making the machine that makes the business solution. That machine happens to be made out of people and processes. So you need to know whether the efficiency of that, the effectiveness of that, so you can tweak it and see whether you're having a positive or a negative impact. If you're worrying about the solutions coming out of it and not the output of that machine, then you're probably not doing your job properly.
I just say make it a strategy. Make a change into a cloud environment not a technical thing. Make it a cultural shift within your organization. Understand that as a strategy, and then start with yourself. And then just try to execute it by being a leader, and by doing it better today than you did yesterday, and even better than tomorrow. So that kind of constant improvement, and that kind of making it a complete strategy for you, for your organization, for everybody being around you, is so important. That is my thoughts on that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.